Hi, everybody. My name is John Demboski. I'm curator of mammals here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I hope you're doing fine out there in these strange and uncertain times. I know it's challenging for everybody, so we're doing the best we can. I'm really pleased I can come to you today to talk about some of the things that right now we can't see, and that's behind the scenes in our extensive collections at the museum. Our museum has about 4.3 million objects, specimens and objects. I'm curator of mammals. That collection goes back from the 1870s to the present. And one of the really interesting things about that collection that I constantly get asked about in the last 14 years I've worked at the museum is about Colorado's last grizzly bear. So today I want to tell you about it's a real fascinating story about this bear, give you a little background on bears in general, and also ask you in comments to tell us where you're streaming from and if you've ever seen a grizzly bear yourself. So right now I'm going to share my screen because I've got a PowerPoint, and I'm going to take you on a virtual tour of our collections and get into the story of this fascinating bear. So here we go. All right, hopefully you can see this now. What this is right here is not Colorado's last grizzly, but it's a diorama in the museum from an area, Chimney Rock in southern Colorado, that's pretty close to where the last grizzly was. The grizzlies in this image right here are actually about 100 years old, but they're from the same population as the Colorado's last grizzly bear. I'd love to be able to take you downstairs into our collection, show you the actual bear. I really love doing that, taking people, telling the stories of the extent of our collections, the history of our collections, and why do we have scientific collections. But you'll have to bear with me, haha, as I take you on a virtual tour here. So our collections, this is the south side of the museum. This is the Morgridge Family Exploration Center. Down below this is the Avenir Collection Center. That's where those 4.3 million objects, specimens are stored. So we would start here. We would go downstairs. There's actually two basement levels, 63,000 square feet. The mammal collection is down with other zoology collections on the bottom floor. So that's way down to the bowels of the museum here. This is a long hallway that we're also down there with the Earth Sciences Department and our zoology collections. If we were to walk into the zoology collections, first of all, we'd get into our collections workspace. And here's an image showing some of our volunteers working in this collection. We have about 700 volunteers that work behind the scenes in our research and collections area, the science division. So if there are volunteers out there for the museum listening to this, I'm going to give you a big shout out for helping us out here. We walk through this collections workspace. Here is the main collections area for zoology. This is about a 9,000 square foot state-of-the-art facility, climate controlled. You see taxidermy mounts on your right and left there. But most of the collection is towards the back there. That would be birds on the left and mostly mammals on the right. Then in the far back, we have marine invertebrates and insects. Now, if we were to walk down the center aisle, kind of down where that person's standing behind the ladder there, that would be into the carnivore section of our mammal collection. And carnivores include things like your big cats, your weasels, your bears, your seals, and here she is Colorado's last known grizzly bear. We have a pelt and the skeleton's right above her, right there. But before I get into the story of how we ended up with this bear in our collection, I would just want to give you a little background on bears in general. You might already know that here in North America, we have 3 species of bear. There's the American black bear. Those are starting to come out of hibernation now in Colorado. I'm seeing more about them in the news as they get into garbage and whatnot. But black bears are one of the more the common species here in North America, US. Polar bears you've heard about. This is a polar bear. I was fortunate enough to go on a trip up to Churchill, Manitoba. Got this shot of a bear on the shore of Hudson Bay. Polar bears are in the news a lot, related to issues around climate change. But the third species of bear is what's known as our brown bear or grizzly bear, Ursus arctos. This would be the bear that you would go up to Yellowstone to see, or go up to Alaska or northern Canada to see. A little bit about some of the terminology. A grizzly bear is a type of brown bear. So all grizzly bears are brown bears, but not all brown bears are grizzly bears. That's because there are multiple types of brown bears across the northern hemisphere on our planet. Up in the top left there is an big Alaska brown bear, the ones you see on the shores of salmon rivers, Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. And upper right there's that Yellowstone grizzly again, type of brown bear. Bottom left would be your Eurasian brown bear. And then one of the more interesting types of brown bears is in the bottom right there. That's a Gobi bear. So the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, China, there's actually a small population, one of the most endangered populations of brown bears on the planet, anywhere from 20 to 50 bears left. And these bears are adapted living out in the harsh Gobi Desert, but they are a relative cousin of our grizzly bear. Grizzly bear itself, here you see the distribution of brown bears across the planet in red. This is the current distribution. They used to be more widespread here in the US, which I'll show you here in a second, but interesting areas, they were all throughout Europe. They were in the British Isles. And one of the more interesting populations, I think, is they used to be in the Atlas Mountains. And if you know your geography, that's Northern Africa. That would be Morocco, Tunisia, that area. So there used to be brown bears there as well. So their overall distribution across the planet has been really reduced over the last 1,000 years. Here in the US, this is the current distribution of brown bears and grizzly bears in North America. That's in the orange right there. But you see they were used to be much more extensive. They were in all the way south into Mexico. That's in the green there. Throughout the Great Plains and throughout most of the lower 48 of the US. Now you see here in the lower 48 of the US, you pretty much only have populations in Yellowstone ecosystem and up around northern Montana, Glacier National Park, and then further up there. So the question becomes, what happened to them over, why are they not in the green areas anymore? And that's a really sad story because it's really human hunting over the last 150 years plus. So this map right here shows that historic range in the light green. And then in the dark green, you see a lot of populations. And then the dates next to them are the dates that those populations were exterminated or went extinct. So if you look here, for example, California, on the California state flag, there's a grizzly bear. Well, grizzly bears were gone from California by the early 20th century. You see in the, excuse me, in the Great Plains, they were gone by, the late 19th century. And then various populations disappear throughout the early 20th century, even down in Mexico, 1962. However, the reason you're here watching me today and what's of interest is right here. Here's this date of 1979 in southern Colorado that kind of stands out. So that's Colorado's last known grizzly bear. And if you start comparing that 1979 date to all the other dates on this map here, you see why it really stands out, because the last known grizzly in Colorado was before that was 1954. So you're going almost 25 years beyond that to 1979. So where is this? To give you a sense, it's the red dot down at the bottom of the map, San Juan Mountains. That's the date from 1979, so just west of the San Luis Valley near Pagosa Springs. And that's where this fascinating, crazy story of our Colorado's last known grizzly bear comes to light here. And that all starts with this gentleman right here, Ed Weisman, on September 23rd, 1979. So Ed Weisman was a hunting guide from Southern Colorado. And on that date in September 1979, he was leading a hunter, and they were on a bow hunting trip for elk. So it was elk season. They were out. They'd been out that day. It was early evening. And to give you a little sense of where they were at, here is a satellite map. They were on the headwaters of the Navajo River. So they were up around 10,000 feet. They were about 20 miles east of Pagosa Springs. And in this valley here, you've got sheer rock walls to the left of that red dot. And then you've got that Navajo River Valley to the right there. So you've kind of got a pretty narrow area that they were hunting in. So that evening, they had split up. It was early evening, around 5 o'clock. They'd split up and they were looking for elk. And Ed hears a sound, looks up, and sees a bear charging him. So before he can get his bow up to defend himself, the bear knocks him down and starts mauling him. And the bear went after his shoulder and also his leg. And it ended up, put his leg into 9 bone fragments, and his shoulder was severely mauled as well. Where the story gets pretty crazy or strange is Ed was able, while he's being mauled by this bear, he's laying on the ground, he's able to grab one of his arrows, aluminum arrow, with a tip and stab the bear twice. The first stab he got in, luckily got the jugular vein of the bear. And then later, a few seconds later, he was able to get a stab into the armpit of the bear, which penetrated to the heart. So it sounds crazy. He's being attacked, and he manages to grab this arrow and stab the bear. After that second stabbing, the bear actually sauntered off a little bit, a few yards away, and died. And here's a actual picture of the bear at the site where this happened. So Ed is he's injured, and his hunting companion goes off on horseback to get help. It wasn't until the next day, on September 24th, that they were able to airlift him out. They brought a helicopter in, airlifted him out, took him to a hospital in Alamosa, and that's where he spent the next month. And I'll get back to that in a second here. But the bear itself, they reported it, and then a lot of officials from the state and even the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife came out to see it, because number one, nobody had seen a grizzly bear in Colorado for almost 25 years, since early 1950s. So here's this bear. Nobody believed that it was a grizzly bear. So they came out to verify that, and they did verify it was a grizzly bear, not a black bear. And also they were extremely skeptical about the story of Ed being charged by this bear, knocked down, mauled, and then able to stab it and kill it to defend himself with that arrow. So that leads back to when he was in the hospital. Like I said, he was there for about a month. He had infections and a lot of injuries. But about 4 days into his hospital stay, he was investigated for hunting and shooting the bear, not in self-defense. So he had to spend that month defending himself through interviews. He even took a polygraph test and passed that. And then that's when the case was dropped. And they accepted that he had defended himself and killed the bear in self-defense. So pretty crazy there. I get stories or people asking about this all the time. A fair number of people know the story of this. They'll call it the Weisman grizzly. When I give behind the scenes tour, people will talk about whether they believe this or not. So truly fascinating in that regard. And, you know, this happened 40 years ago. That was last September, the anniversary of this, and it still comes up. There were a lot of articles in newspapers last September on this same story. And I just hear across the board, people that believe the story or don't believe it. Frankly, I believe the story. It sounds very plausible, and you have to remember that he spent a month in the hospital with pretty grievous injuries. So the bear itself ended up in our museum in 1980, and I'll show you a couple pictures of her here. This is her pelt right here. What do we know about this bear? She was a female. She was probably about 350 to 400 pounds. That's within the range of a female grizzly bear from the Southern Rockies. With bears, there's what's known as sexual dimorphism, meaning that the males are sometimes 1.5 to 2 times as large as the females. So the males can be very large, females much smaller relative to the male bear. Here's another image of her pelt here. And then here is her skeleton. We have most of the skeleton. We don't have the front right leg and the shoulder bone there, scapula. But what do we know about this bear from the skeleton? Well, it's a little tough to see here, but the bear has a lot of bone spurs on many of its bones. So that's a good sign that she had osteoarthritis, which also means fits the story that she was an older bear. And the estimates are up to 15 to 20 years old. Bears can live longer in the wild beyond 20 years, but that is getting up there for a bear. We also know from the skull that she was an older bear as well. And I'll show you a couple here. It'll be real obvious here. There's another picture. And the thing about the skull, I said that what's left of the bear is behind the scenes in our collections. But we do have her skull on display in the museum. So when the museum opens again here, hopefully pretty soon, if you visit and go up to our second floor on our bear and sea mammal gallery, you'll be able to see her skull. Here it is right here. And it's in a case right next to a big Alaska brown bear to show some of the differences in sizes here. If you look at her skull right here, notice the upper canine right here. Her teeth are really worn down, once again, telling us that she was an older bear. And you can see she had a abscess tooth. So she had an infection there on her tooth right there. So definitely an older bear here. So the question I get all the time is, people ask for my opinion whether we still have grizzlies in Colorado. I have to say, I haven't seen the proof on that. I get time to time people tell me stories of seeing bears in Colorado, large brown bears they see. But you also have to remember, and here it is, there's some differences between black bears, which we have in the state, and grizzly bears, which we seem to no longer have in the state. But there's also a lot of overlap. Many of you may know that black bears aren't always black. They can be a cinnamon color, a light brown. Remember I had mentioned sexual dimorphism. A large male black bear can be upwards of 600 to 700 pounds and be bigger than a female grizzly bear. So you can see a very large black bear that also has brown coloration and confuse that with a grizzly bear. This little diagram tells you some of the differences between the two species, the bear, the black bear and the grizzly bear. One thing that grizzlies are known for is the hump on their shoulder up there, which a black bear usually doesn't have. Grizzlies tend to be overall larger, but once again, remember that there's differences in males and females in size. Claws are longer on the grizzly bear. It can be 2 to 4 inches versus about 1 to 1.5 inches on a black bear. So there's overlap. They can be tough to tell, especially if you're just seeing a brown shape or black shape off from a distance. So that makes it even more to where I get a lot of questions about this. And Colorado Parks and Wildlife gets a lot of questions about people seeing what they think are grizzly bears in the state. If they're here, we don't have the proof yet that they're here. It's real interesting to kind of wrap this up here is that Grizzlies are those kind of apex predators that were in Colorado along with wolves. There's been a lot if you follow Colorado politics and the news, you'll see there's been a lot of push to bring wolves back into the state. It's even to get it on a ballot to vote to do that and push that. Grizzlies, less so. There have been some organizations that have looked at possibly bringing them back. And the one area they've identified potentially is the San Juan Mountains. That's the same area where this grizzly was, last grizzly was found. So it brings up a lot of interesting questions and discussion about should we bring back some of these animals that used to be part of our ecosystem and landscape here. One thing that I do, and I'll ask you this, particularly for those of you who live here in Colorado and are listening, whenever I bring people behind the scenes to show off this bear and talk about it, I always ask them, would you like grizzlies to be brought back? And typically people say yes, but with a lot of caveats. And the caveat is not to bring them back into the Front Range along the Denver area, because that's where the population is. So a lot of people say they want the bears back, but not where they're taking their families to go hiking and whatnot. So real interesting from that standpoint. So that's what I have on our last grizzly bear here in Colorado. This statue right here is actually called Grizzly's Last Stand outside the west side of our museum. And people were already talking about grizzlies being gone because this statue predates the Colorado's last grizzly bear by many decades. So I will stop the sharing here and open it up for any questions you might have for me about the bear or anything else, and I'll try and answer them for you.
Hey, John.
Hi, Memory.
I'm going to read off these questions for you. Hi, everybody. I'll just introduce myself. My name is Memory, and I am the social media and digital engagement specialist at the museum. So let's get these questions answered. We have one from Mina who asks, does the grizzly have a name?
Oh, great question. Does the grizzly have a name? Yes and no. So does the name, people refer to it lots of times, and I know exactly what they're talking about is when they say, I'm here to see the Weisman grizzly. So people will give the name from Ed Weisman, the hunting guide that was attacked by the bear. So good question. Yeah, Weisman grizzly. I refer to it sometimes like that as well.
Weisman grizzly. Awesome. We have another question from Colleen. Colleen asks, what do brown bear conservation efforts look like?
Brown bear conservation efforts, really interesting. So actually, black bears and brown bears, or your grizzly, in many areas are not on endangered species list. So in many areas, the bears are doing pretty well. Places like Alaska, northern Canada, they're doing pretty well in Yellowstone ecosystem and Glacier National Park. Where there have been a lot of conservation efforts beyond like thoughts of reintroducing them to like Colorado or other places they used to be, Mexico, California, has also been over in Eurasia. So I mentioned that Gobi bear. That's one of the most endangered species or populations of bears on the planet, 20 to 50. They're not doing so well over there. They actually have to feed those bears. So about 10 years ago, I went to Mongolia, was down in the Gobi Desert, and actually got to go to an oasis out in the middle of the Gobi Desert that had a feeding station for Gobi bears. So the population is hit so hard and stressed so much that they actually have to set up these feeding stations to feed bears. Also, I'd mention if you saw in Europe, brown bears used to be throughout Europe and into the British Isles. So there have been some countries over there, particularly like Romania, parts of Germany, that have looked into bringing the bears back and then trying to conserve them and increase their populations. The thing about grizzlies and brown bears is there's a lot of politics around them. There's private land, there's federal lands, same thing here in Colorado. And they're not beloved by many segments of the population, which led to their demise in the first place. So great question.
All right, we got another one from Toby. Toby asks, was she born in the state, and how was she the last grizzly?
Oh, another good question. Was she born in the state? I can't definitively say that because if you remember, she was killed down in the San Juan Mountains. She was pretty close to the New Mexico border, so she could have come over from New Mexico. But one interesting thing is, even though we don't know exactly where she was from, we do know that there were grizzlies. Some of the last grizzlies before her in Colorado were from that same part of the state, the San Juan Mountains. And some interesting things that have come out, and even people have told me over the years, is I've had people tell me that, 2 years before 1979, when the bear was killed, I was actually down in the San Juan Mountains and saw what I think was probably the same bear or maybe another grizzly as well. So there's a lot of stories out there about Colorado's last grizzly bear, how long she was there. Why hadn't we seen a bear in 25 years in that area since the early 50s, since the last time one was seen? So I don't have a definitive answer if she was born there. She probably was there close. Another thing is people ask me if she's a female, did she have cubs? Where were the cubs? That's another one where we don't have an answer for. So.
Okay, I think we have time for these last two questions. We have one from Kenneth. Kenneth asks, when was the last time Ed visited the collection?
Oh, okay. Good question. He came in, and I don't have the exact date, a few years ago. I didn't actually meet him. He came in, he sort of showed up at the front because I think he still has family, and he said he was here to see his bear. And I wasn't around, but our collections manager, Jeff Stevenson, was able to interact with him. So that happened a few years ago. I know he's asked about that bear all the time. And here's another interesting thing. If you want to learn more about the bear, there's actually a book written about the bear. It was written by a family friend of his, Deborah Carpenter Notel, and her. It's called Grizzly Attack in Colorado. So you can probably look it up on the web if you want to learn more about it.
Awesome.
And did you say we have time for one more question?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Okay.
Danani asks, I noticed that the grizzly population in Yellowstone is separate from Glacier and northwest of there. Do you think that there is a difference between the populations in Yellowstone and Glacier due to that separation, or do they likely travel between the two?
Oh, that's a great question, and good eyes on that map there, because that's a real interesting thing that people bring up all the time, particularly biologists looking at this, is what is known as corridors between these populations. So you have all these fragmented populations, and can bears or any other animals travel between those, going from Yellowstone in Wyoming, southern Montana, up to northern Montana. And I may be, don't hold me to this, I may be wrong, but I don't think there's much traffic between the Glacier National Park bears up in northern Montana and the Yellowstone ecosystem. There may be one or two, don't hold me to it, but I don't think there's much there travel. So they are pretty much isolated populations at the moment, which is why a lot of people, biologists, spend a lot of time trying to think of how to increase the chance of gene flow, if you will, and mixing of populations with these wildlife corridors. That is actually a question that would come up if we were to bring these bears back to the Southern Rockies in Colorado. Would they be isolated? Where would we bring the bears from? Would we just take some Yellowstone bears and bring them down to Colorado? Because the interesting thing about this is our bear, the Colorado's last grizzly bear, which is in our collection, actually was subsampled. We took a little bit of toe pad from her off her pelt, a bunch of years ago, and some work was done on genetic analysis. And what they found out was that the Southern Rockies grizzlies were actually a distinct population. You could identify them genetically. They were different from more northerly grizzlies. So your question kind of brings up a lot of topics about, you know, how isolated these populations were in the past, how isolated are they now, how would we conserve a population if both in Yellowstone and northern Montana and Glacier and further north, or if we were to bring them and introduce them, say, back into Colorado or California or Mexico. So, great question. So it looks like we're right up at 12:30. Thank you for listening. I don't know how many out there were listening, but I know I got some questions, so I appreciate that. Thank you, Memory, for hosting for me.
No
And,
problem.
you know, there's tons of resources out there on grizzlies. Pretty much every state has information on bears. So if you go look in Montana, they've got information on grizzly bears if you want to learn more about them. And so I encourage you to go out and learn more about grizzlies and think about it. Do you want them back in, say, if you're from Colorado here in this state, or they used to be in North Dakota, in Missouri, and areas like that. So should we bring them back? Great questions. So thanks for listening, and have a great day and a great weekend.
Yeah.
And hope to see you in the museum at some point here in the near future. Thanks.